Second service, how we doing? Well, it is fantastic to be with you on what really is kind of a big deal Sunday for the American church and really even, I would say, American culture. You may not be aware, but tomorrow is the 60th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech that, of course, was given on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It's widely considered one of the most important and influential speeches in the last 100 years of American history. So it's a big deal. And it actually has a really kind of cool story surrounding the speech. King didn't plan on giving the I Have a Dream speech. That wasn't the plan. In fact, he opens the speech. I mean, it's meticulously scripted. If you watch the video, and you should, go tomorrow, celebrate 60 years of his speech, go watch the clip. He's constantly referring to his notes. He's scripted out what he wanted to say, and he's just going down the script. And you can see him, he's constantly referencing the script. And you may even be familiar with how he kind of opens the speech. Here's what he says. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, Lincoln is like right behind him when he says those words. But here's what's interesting. King, I think, is not getting the response he'd hoped for from the more than 200,000 people in attendance on that day. But as the story goes, Mahalia Jackson, legendary gospel singer, she had set King up. She sang a couple of songs before King. He's the last of actually 7 communicators that are there that day. I mean, it's like a full kind of whole situation. And Mahalia Jackson, she can see from sort of the side of the stage that he's not getting the response that he wanted. And so the story goes that Mahalia Jackson shouts out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And now she knows about the dream because he's given the I Have a Dream speech before. In fact, just a couple of months prior in Detroit, he'd given the speech to a crowd of about 25,000 people. And here's what's fascinating. If you go watch the video, go home, watch the video, watch it tomorrow. This prompts King to go off script. He no longer keeps referring down to his notes, and he improvises, and he gives America his I Have a Dream speech. And you might remember how it goes. Here's how he kind of opens that bit of the speech. "I say to you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." I think most of you in the room know the story. 5 years later, the age of 39, April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is murdered by James Earl Ray as he's standing on the balcony of his hotel room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, having given his life for the cause of justice. Now, here's my question. I was thinking about MLK this week. Why? Why would he give his life for that? I mean, what was his motivation? I mean, what made him so resilient and steadfast? His sort of, I'm not going to quit. This is the cause. I'm willing to give my life. In fact, you can go back to speech after speech, comment after comment. He's aware of the fact that what he's doing may result in his death. In fact, just weeks prior to this, to his execution, his assassination, he gave us a speech where he talked about how he didn't really think he'd survive the civil rights movement. And prior to him being assassinated, he'd already survived one assassination attempt. Right, about a decade earlier, he's in a library, he's signing, he's just meeting a small crowd, and a woman walks up to him who is mentally ill and says, "Are you Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?" He said, "Yes." She stabbed him in the chest. At this point, he'd been arrested 29 times. What kept him going? Why would he not stop? He had a family. He had a life. He had a lot more to give. 39 is pretty young. What kept him going? And so I wanted to know the answer to that question. So this week, actually, I read a lot about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I read a lot of what he had written and a lot of his texts of his speeches. I read a lot about what other people have written about Martin Luther King. And here's my conclusion. The thing that kept him going, his motivation, why he stuck to it, even though he had a sense he wouldn't survive. What kept him going was the cross of Christ. The cross. King believed that the cross was the defining heart of the Christian faith. In fact, he saw the cross as the tool used by God to heal the differences between people. And for MLK and the leaders of the civil rights movement, that very practically meant that white supremacy is never going to have the final and ultimate word on human relationships. The cross meant that Jesus got the final word. And the final word that Jesus gives us on the cross is love. Love. The cross is all about love. The cross reminds us that God is love, and then the cross also defines exactly what that love looks like. It's why Christians make such a big deal about the cross. Right? We're in this series. Next week we'll wrap this series up. We're calling it Jesus for Everyone, and we're just looking at Jesus for the full month. We're talking about who is Jesus and how can we kind of wrap our head around really the most influential person in the history of the world. How do we understand Jesus? Just as a person from history, but also from a Christian perspective. And why do Christians think this Jesus guy is such a big deal? Well, the cross is part of it. We can't really understand Jesus if we don't understand the cross. And I think you could argue that King understood the cross, and it was his motivation, his driving fire that led him to be the champion of the American civil rights movement, and ultimately would lead to his death. You know, Jesus' best friend, a man named John, he was writing a letter late in his life to some other Christians, Jesus people, and he wanted to explain to them the cross. And the cross is just so big, and the idea and everything that's happening on the cross. I mean, people have written volume after volume after volume over the last 2,000 years about the cross. But Jesus' best friend maybe just summed it up best when he said this. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, so we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers and sisters. In other words, we understand love because of the cross. That's the only way that we actually understand love, by way of the cross. And what is the cross? It's sacrificial. It's other-centered. That's the cross. It's where God flexes his supernatural muscles and allows evil to kill him on behalf of the human species. In fact, the cross is what inspired MLK's nonviolent civil rights movement. After all, if Jesus didn't fight back, how could Martin Luther King Jr.? On the cross, so much is happening. The cross is, and I've summarized it this way for us this morning, on the cross is the ultimate expression of God's love. So that's the first thing happening on the cross. The second thing is the cross is how Jesus, it's the instrument used to defeat death and darkness once and for all. So that's kind of cosmic, big picture, kind of what's happening in the spiritual realm, all of that. But thirdly, the cross also serves as the coronation ceremony of Jesus. It's Jesus's inauguration, if you will. The cross is where Jesus gets crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, it's interesting, and you may not be aware of this, but one of the biographies that have survived of the life of Jesus was written by an early Christian missionary named Mark. And Mark sees this. He really emphasizes the cross as Jesus's coronation ceremony or Jesus's inauguration. The cross is where Jesus is being crowned king. For Mark, for this biographer of the life of Jesus, this early Christian missionary, the cross was not an image of defeat at all, but an image of victory. It was the moment that Jesus's authority is finally made official. And what I'd like to show you this morning is how Mark talked about that. I just want to show you how an early Christian missionary, how he understood the cross. Yes, there's lots going on the cross, but primarily Mark is the guy that understood the cross, Jesus' execution, as the moment he's crowned King of Kings. Now, he talks about it in such an interesting way, such a subversive way. It's not very in our face at all. We actually have to know a little bit about what was going on in the world at the time of Jesus' crucifixion if we're going to see how Mark really shapes the whole moment as Jesus' crowning achievement. So you'll remember, we talk about this a lot, that the Roman Empire was ruling the world at the time of Jesus' birth, his life, and ultimately his death. Rome was in charge, right? And Rome had a king. And his name, he was the Roman emperor. They would often be called just simply Caesar. And he was the ruler of the known world. His power and authority was unquestioned. He was often worshiped as divine himself. The first emperor, Augustus, was literally talked about as the son of the gods, right? I mean, this is the man. If you're Caesar, if you're the emperor of Rome, you are in charge of everything. You are the most powerful person in the world. And the most powerful person in the world, and by his authority, Jesus gets executed for crimes against the state, the Roman Empire. Rome didn't do it totally by themselves, right? They were in collusion or collaboration with the Jewish religious establishment of the day. Now, here's what Mark does. Now we know all of that. Here's what Mark does. Mark, when a Caesar is crowned king, when a Roman emperor is inaugurated, when he comes into power, there's a ceremony behind it, much like our president's inaugural day, right? There's a ceremony about it. When new leaders come into power, there's usually a ceremony, there's usually a party, there's some things happening, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. Well, when a new Roman emperor was brought into power, there was a lot of pomp and circumstance. There was a lot of ceremonial things happening around that. And actually, it's really interesting. There was really kind of 8 significant moments that we can sort of track in the inauguration of any new Roman Caesar. Now, here's what Mark does, and I think it's so cool, and I think it's so fascinating. What Mark does, and no other biographer of the life of Jesus really does that. What Mark does is he takes those significant key moments in the inaugural ceremony of a Roman Caesar, and he puts them on top of Jesus' journey to the cross. And he compares and he contrasts, and he says, you know, it's kind of interesting how this guy up in Rome thinks he's ruling the world, and why this guy up in Rome, through his authority, Jesus is being executed. I think that's what everybody thinks, but I want you to look underneath the surface, because really, he's being crowned king. And it's really fascinating. So here's what I'm going to do today. It's really, really simple. I'm going to take those 8 moments that happen in the inauguration ceremony of a new Roman Caesar, and I'm just going to tell you about them. And then I'm going to jump to Mark's biography, and I'm going to show you how he took that moment and placed it in the story of Jesus' journey to the cross. Does that sound okay? Does that sound like we can kind of track with that? Now, I know you're thinking there's 8 of them for us. We're going to be here till noon. It's like I'm going to go so fast, you're going to miss some of it. I'm going to just burn through this really, really fast. But through the whole thing, I just want you to see how Mark is taking how everyone thought the known ruler of the world came into power, and he's twisting it and saying, well, here's how the actual ruler of the world comes in to power. And it's upside down, and it doesn't make any sense at all. And it looks like death, and it looks like defeat, and it looks like loss. But I'm telling you, on the cross, the King of Kings is once and for all crowned. And it's a moment of victory. It's vindication. It's Jesus being crowned king and given all the authority. So you ready for that? You ready to see what Mark does? He's a clever guy. So here's what Mark does. Let's just walk through it moment by moment. A Caesar's inauguration, Jesus' death on the cross. Moment number 1. Here's the first thing that would happen. The Praetorian Guard would gather. The Praetorian Guard is Caesar's, it's his secret service. It's his guys. It's his closest. Now, there'd be a lot of them, sometimes up to 3,000 Praetorian Guards. And they hung out in a place called the Praetorium. And the first moment in a Caesar's inauguration ceremony is Caesar would everybody would gather in the Praetorium, and Caesar would be brought into the middle of all of those soldiers. With that in mind, look what Mark does. Here's moment number 1 for Jesus. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the Praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. Just like Caesar's being brought to the Praetorium and being put in the middle of all of the soldiers, so is Jesus, quite literally. Now, after Jesus is brought to the center, so here's moment 2. It's the king's crown. The next moment is the Caesar is given essentially the crown jewels. They would send a few of the soldiers, these Praetorian guards, up to the most sacred temple in Rome. The big temple is on a hill called the Capitoline Hill. It was the tallest hill in Rome. And on top of that hill was the temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, right? Big deal. Jupiter is Rome's head god, just like Zeus is the Greeks' head god, right? So they're kind of equivalent. And they would send a few soldiers up to run up to the temple, and they would get essentially the crown jewels. They would get a purple robe, an olive wreath made of gold, and a scepter signifying the authority of Rome. And they'd go grab it, and they'd bring it down, and they would place it on the king, the new Caesar. Okay, so that's moment 2. Let's jump to Jesus' moment 2. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. Do you see what Mark's doing? Can you already start to see that Mark's being very, very clever, comparing and contrasting Caesar and Jesus, Caesar and Jesus. I know you think Caesar's the Son of God and the King of Kings and the ruler of the known world, but I'm telling you, Jesus is the ruler. He's the Son of God. He's all of that. So, all right, moment 3. I told you we're going to move through these very, very fast. So everyone's brought in, moment 1, Praetorium, Caesar's brought into the middle of the Praetorian Guard, he's given the crown jewels, that's moment 2. After that, he's hailed as king, that's moment 3. Caesar's hailed as king. So after they put the purple robe on and the crown and the scepter and all of that, he's proclaimed the triumphant king, the phrase, "Hail Caesar." The soldiers shout out. Here's Jesus' moment 3. As they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews," again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. Again, are you picking up what's happening here and what Mark's trying to do? And it's so easy for us, 2,000 years removed, to miss what Mark's doing, because we don't really know about Caesar's inauguration. That wasn't part of our world, but it is most certainly a part of the world that Mark's writing to. He's a missionary in the Roman Empire. He's not in Jerusalem. He's out in the world with a bunch of Romans who know full well how Caesar's brought into power. And he's saying, let's just look how Jesus is brought into power. The same way they hail Caesar, yes, it was sarcastic. Yes, it was mockery, but they are doing the same thing. They're hailing Jesus as king. They're falling on their knees and they're paying homage. All of this is happening in the Praetorium. Moment 4 is when we move out of the Praetorium and out onto the streets of Rome. For Jesus, it would be out into the streets of Jerusalem. There's a big parade, all the fanfare, everything, right? There'd be a parade through the streets of Rome, a parade. Jesus goes through this parade through the streets of Jerusalem. What was interesting about the parade is the order of the parade. So there'd be lots of, guards and lots of fanfare. Right in the middle is Caesar. Behind Caesar's a bull, and right next to the bull is a slave. And the slave would be holding the axe, the tool of death that would ultimately kill the bull, that would be the sacrifice to the god Jupiter. And so that's what's happening, right? So here's the parade. You've got, a bunch of people, then Caesar, then the bull, and then next to the bull is the slave holding the instrument of death, the thing that's going to kill the bull. That's Caesar's moment 4. Here's Jesus' moment 4, his parade. When they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out. We're leaving the Praetorium now. We're on our parade to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Okay, This is important. Jesus' procession begins, but instead of a bowl, Jesus is that, right? Jesus, the would-be king, he becomes the actual sacrifice, right? He's the bull in this picture. But we're told, remember, that the bull, like there was a slave, there was a guy. Caesar's not carrying the axe. The bull's obviously not carrying the axe, but there's a slave that would carry the axe, this instrument of death. Well, it's exactly what happened in Jesus' parade. Simon the Cyrene carried the tool that would serve as Jesus' execution tool, the cross. Simon here is the slave with the axe. Jesus here is the bull, and they're on parade towards, for Caesar, it would be the head hill, the Capitoline Hill with this temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. For Jesus, it would be the head hill, the place of the skull, literally, Golgotha or Calvary, right? So Caesar's processional, that's moment 5. Arrival at the head hill, arrival at the place where we're going to do the sacrifice, right? And again, for Caesar, the parade leads up to the Capitoline Hill. They move through the Roman Forum that's at the bottom of the Capitoline Hill, and they go up the hill. There's the temple. They're going to move into the temple. They're going to sacrifice the bull. They're going to do all of that. Here's what we read happens in Jesus, with Jesus' moment, number 5. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, again, which means place of the skull, or some translations, the head hill, right? This is where they brought Jesus. Now, once they're at Golgotha, and once they're at the head hill, in the Capitoline Hill, Caesar's offered some wine. Now, every good party has a little wine, and of course, the inauguration of the ruler of the known world, there's going to be a little bit of wine. But it's kind of interesting. It's a bit of a cocktail. It's not just wine. They would enter the temple. They would go up to the altar. And then the slave that was carrying the axe, so now there's a bowl of wine mixed with myrrh. And the slave offers this to Caesar. Caesar accepts the bowl with the cocktail of wine and myrrh, but then he gives it back. Now the slave also refuses to drink the wine, and now the wine is poured out onto the altar, or sometimes even poured out onto the bowl that's about to be sacrificed. Here's Jesus' moment, number 6. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, same cocktail, but he did not take it, and they sacrificed him, right? Because Caesar's, when they're there after the whole wine ceremony, they killed a bull. Here, they're crucifying Jesus. Do you see the similarities? Are you seeing how clever Mark is, painting us a picture, how the king gets crowned in Jesus' kingdom? We're nearing the end. Moment 7. Now, this is interesting. For Caesar, this is where he's choosing his cabinet, if you will. Just like a president has a cabinet, Caesar had a cabinet, but really it was just sort of number 2 and number 3 in charge, right? He would, after the bull sacrifice, Caesar gathered number 2 and number 3. They would be seated in sort of their thrones. And as that's happening, here's what's happening in Jesus' version of this story. They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Now, what's interesting about this is these are just random people. In fact, we could call them certainly common criminals, but they were probably more than that. They were being crucified because they were rebels, insurrectionists, terrorists, if you will. And this is who's being placed on Jesus' right and left. This is who's being chosen for Jesus' cabinet, because his followers are in the shadows. They've ditched him. They didn't want any part of this. They're watching from a distance. Here's the last thing that happens. So you've got now Caesar. We've left the Praetorium. We've done the parade. We've gone up to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. We've sacrificed the bull. We did the wine thing. We're now seated. There's Caesar, his number 2, his number 3. After all of that happens, the last thing that happens is the crowds get involved, and they proclaim him Caesar. The crowds hail Caesar, the new ruler of the world, one that is divine and to be worshiped. Now, after the crowds would hail the new Caesar as king of the world, typically the Romans would interpret something that happens as a divine seal of approval. Maybe it was a flock of doves that flew by. Maybe it was a solar eclipse. Just about anything. We'd say, look, that thing that just happened, that eagle that flew by, whatever, that's the God's seal of approval. That's them saying all of this is good and this is now our new and rightful ruler of the world. So the crowds hail Caesar and then the gods hail Caesar and give their divine approval. Here's how this looks in Jesus's version of the story. Those who passed by, the crowds, hurled insults at him, shaking their heads, saying, "So you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross, save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests, teachers of the law, that's the Jewish religious establishment that helped get Jesus on that cross, of the law, mocked him among themselves. It goes on. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, again, they're hailing him king, come down from the cross that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. So even his number 2 and number 3, metaphorically, right, is symbols. They're mocking Jesus, hailing Jesus as king, if you will. Now, Jesus also gets some divine seal of approval. If you know the story, here's what happens. After Jesus is crucified, after he dies, at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. So middle of the day, we've got darkness. And then the curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. Now, the Jewish temple in Jesus' day, a massive complex, and there's some outer courts, and then there's an inner court. There's an inner room called the Holy of Holies. They actually believe that God, this is where the presence of God dwelt. And that was separated by a massive curtain that was so big and so heavy, it would take like 300 of the Jewish priests to move this thing. It was as thick as your hand, massively heavy. This thing is ripped in two when Jesus breathes his last death. And it provides us, I think, a beautiful image that God is now sort of tearing open the temple and he is setting all of the sacred things free. This Holy of Holies, this inner sanctum could no longer contain God. On the cross, God has busted out of the temple. He's busted out of dry, aged religion. And now God is out on the streets for all to be invited in, not just the insiders. As Jesus is being crowned king, led to his inaugural, what would be execution, the symbolism for you and I is lost a little, but the symbolism for Mark's audience is rich. It's unmistakable. The purple robe, the crown of thorns, the processional, all of it would have been so familiar to Mark's audience. And at the pinnacle, the crucifixion, Jesus dies. And here's what we read is the response of what would be a Roman captain, or like our military's version of a captain. Here's what happens. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man is the Son of God." A Roman soldier who had undoubtedly pledged his allegiance to Caesar, the Son of God, the ruler of the world, the King of Kings. In Mark's biography, it's interesting. Not all the biographies are shaped this way. They all have their own way that they shape the story of Jesus. But in Mark's shaping of the Jesus story, a Roman soldier who has pledged allegiance to Caesar is the first one to declare Jesus as the Son of God. He's the one. No one else does it in Mark's story. Mark opens his Jesus story by saying, I'm about to tell you the story of Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah. So he tells us this is the story we're telling, but no one gets it. No one gets it until this guy, a Roman who already had another king, who already had another God, and his name was Caesar. Do you see what Mark's doing? Yeah? It's pretty fascinating. It's clever. It's beautiful. And it's upside down. The inauguration ceremony of a Caesar was filled with a party, ornate, massive, expensive. The crucifixion of Jesus, the exact opposite of that. Suffering, pain, death. And Mark's argument is that this is the way of the cross. This is how power works in Jesus' kingdom. This is how love works in Jesus' kingdom. This is how people are exalted. When we're most horrified, Jesus, Mark's argument is, being most glorified. Mark's sort of flipping the whole story of the world on its head. That the suffering way of the cross is this ironic and astounding way, Mark's argument is, I think, that life and love are coming into the world. The cross, please, it's not just some necessary step in some religion's plan of salvation. Sure, but this is way more than that. That's a weak cross. The cross is where God is crowned king. His crucifixion is this coronation ceremony. It's how God's will is getting done on earth as it is in heaven. The cross isn't a step in a plan. The cross is the way. It's the whole deal. The cross is an entirely different way to view the world, an entirely different way to view success, an entirely different way to understand the meaning of history. On the cross, we find a God who loves his enemies, who prays for those who abuse him. The cross is where the world's wrath is poured out on God. The cross is this ultimate power standoff. On the cross, we see what love looks like when it stares evil in the face. The whole world shook. The sun stood still, and love prevailed. On the cross, we see a self-sacrificing God who becomes a human and dies on a cross, praying for our forgiveness with his last breath. He's a beautiful God who would do and has done anything and everything possible to save us from our own self-destructive patterns and restore us and invite us into a never-ending, life-giving relationship with him. God is love. I've told you this before, but ask anybody. Ask anybody who believes in some sort of deity if they think that deity is love. Everyone will answer yes. Then ask this question: how do you know? How do you know? Is it just wishful thinking? Christians know. They know that God is love because of the cross. And we even now know what this love looks like. It's other-centered. It's sacrificial. It's not power over. It's power that comes from under, serving others. Love looks like Jesus dying on a cross, that he takes on our life, our pain, our suffering, so that we might take on his life and the fullness of that life. The cross, we're set free from legalism, dry religion, religious expectations. We're set free from that. We're brought in to a brand new world defined by love. On the cross, Jesus reveals himself as king. When we look into the face of Jesus on the cross, we are looking into the face of a God who loved the world so much that he would sacrifice his own life, not to condemn, but to save. No one has greater love than this, Jesus' friend would say, that they'd lay down his life for another. It's this love, it's this cross that I think Dr. King staked his life on, and it cost him his life, and he knew it probably would. It's this kind of love, it's cross-shaped love that birthed King's dream. Because the cross is where heaven meets earth, so that the love of heaven can embrace us creatures of earth, so that the light of heaven can heal the darkness we find here on earth. The cross is when Jesus completes his rescue plan He sort of enters this shameful, chaotic, horrible death. He's gone to the very bottom of the darkest place of ruin, and he just sort of plants this sign that on it reads, rescued. The cross is the sign of love, the love of a creator for his creation, the love of a savior for his people. I do not grasp the cross fully. I really don't. I just think there's a lot going on. In fact, if you read the Christian scripture, there's a lot of theories that sort of will pop up. There's a lot of different images that get shown. The cross is the place of victory. The cross is the place of substitution. The cross is the place of ransom. I mean, there's all sorts, because there's not any one idea that can grasp all that's happening on the cross. I don't know that I have all the answers about the cross, but I'm pretty sure the cross is the place where I go for all the answers. Does that make sense? The cross is when God comes into our chaos to be with us right in the middle of it. I mean, what's your chaos right now? Whatever it is, the cross is the promise that Jesus is right there with us in the middle of it. And that love will never fail. Love defeated darkness and death. Isn't that pretty cool what Mark does? I'm not nearly as smart as that guy. But I think it's beautiful. Because of the cross and because of what Mark had to say about the cross, we worship a king. He's not just a buddy. In Christianity, Jesus is lots of things. He's a buddy, he's a friend, he's a savior. But he's a king. He had his own inauguration ceremony. He was crowned King of Kings, and we worship him as such. And Christians ultimately submit to this king, his rule in our lives, and say, teach us how to do this thing we call life. Are we okay? All right. Well, can I pray for us? And then y'all can go sign up for a group after. Let's pray. Jesus, thanks so much for today. And man, the cross is a lot. And today it's your crowning, it's your coronation, it's your inaugural ceremony. It's the moment that we hail you as King of Kings. And would you be King of our lives? Would you be the one we go to learn how to do life and to find life and to find hope in our darkness? That whatever our chaos is this morning, we would see in a very real way that sign you planted that just reads, rescued. We love you, Jesus. Amen. Thanks, guys.